The Eighth Amendment text is quite simple. No excessive bail, no cruel and unusual punishment.
When that Eighth Amendment was ratified, the death penalty was not considered to be prohibited. Indeed, the death penalty existed in all the states and was the only penalty for a felony.
The definition of cruel and unusual would come from the courts and primarily from the U.S. Supreme Court.
Historically, punishment that is now considered cruel and unusual was once acceptable and frequently implemented.
There are times when one must move dramatically away from stare decisis. In the 19th century, both the Constitution and statutory law and common law all would have recognized a distinction between Caucasian citizens and those who were non-Caucasian, primarily African Americans.
In 1972, in a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court ruled that capital punishment, as currently employed on the state and federal level, is unconstitutional. The majority held that, in violation of the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, the death penalty was qualified as cruel and unusual punishment, primarily because states employed execution in arbitrary and capricious ways, especially in regard to race.
In the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was very high public support for the death penalty. It was measured in the polls at around 80%.
By the mid-20th century, there was a recognition that that was simply wrong. It was indefensible from any perspective. And so consequently, courts moved dramatically in a different direction.
Well, I think what we're seeing is the continuation of a long-term trend. At this point, we're looking at support for the death penalty in the abstract that has fallen to near 40-year lows. The Pew Research poll and the CBS poll put support for the death penalty at 56%, the Gallup poll at 61%.
What is undeniable is that as public opinion has changed over time, juries are less likely to impose the death penalty.
People in America don't want to be sentencing innocent people to death, and they don't want to take the risk of executing innocent people.
There is no doubt that public opinion affects how the U.S. Supreme Court rules in matters as public opinion changes over time.
As general standards of decency evolve and public opinion changes, court cases concerning capital punishment are increasingly complex and multifarious. Consequently, death sentences are only imposed after diligent evaluation, or not at all.
In Atkins versus Virginia, this court held that the Eighth Amendment prohibits executing people who are intellectually disabled. And in Hall versus Florida, this court reiterated that the inquiry into whether somebody is intellectually disabled for that important Eighth Amendment purpose should be informed by the medical community's diagnostic framework and by clinical standards.
On the front end, there are ongoing problems with issues of innocence. Last year, 6 more innocent people were exonerated from death row, bringing the death row exoneration total since 1973 all the way up to 156. On top of the problems with innocence, we have persistent problems with racial discrimination in the application of the death penalty.
Consequently, it is often argued that those who are less affluent, uneducated, and/or a minority are more likely to be condemned to capital punishment.
When one looks objectively at the statistics going back 30, 40, 50 years, there is a great deal of support for that conclusion. When it comes to capital cases, the compensation scale is dramatically higher to ensure that someone who has been accused of a capital crime will have the best possible representation from a court-appointed attorney. Only qualified attorneys can represent clients in capital cases.
Despite all of the issues and controversy that seems to be connected to the Eighth Amendment, the amendment itself is instrumental in the preservation of society as we know it. It does not discriminate based on gender, financial status, race, or religion. The Eighth Amendment serves all Americans equally by preventing the government from overexerting their power. It suppresses corruption and oppression, thus encouraging each and every one of us to live without fearing those who lurk with power and exploit it for selfish gain. It empowers us to keep moving forward without fear, without hesitation.